Good morning. Welcome to Behind the Gavel with Jason. Today we're going to be talking about antique quilts. What do Dresden Plate, Drunkard's Path, Four Patch, Nine Patch, Bear Paw, Churn Dash, Log Cabin, Flying Geese, Rose of Sharon, Applique, and dozens more terms have in common with each other? They're all names for antique quilts and actually for contemporary quilts. Quilting is one of the very few antique areas of the industry that is still widely practiced today. So today we're going to talk about antiques. We have a wonderful antique quilt collection coming up to auction really soon. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to talk about antique quilts today. So what makes an antique quilt valuable? Let's talk about the history of antique quilts first. Quilting's been around since medieval times. The Victorian Albert Museum kind of defined quilting as a method of stitching layers of fabric together to create an object, whether that's a blanket or a coverlet or bedding or clothing or decorative objects, whatever it might be. Quilting is just applying two or more pieces of quilt fabrics together in a way that's either useful or decorative. Like I said, it's been around since medieval times. The term quilt kind of is traced back to the 13th century, an Italian term, quilt, I think is what it was. But there's dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of quilts out there. What we're most familiar with here in America and what comes on the market most often is a patchwork quilt, which is what we have behind us, an example of behind us. There's quilting and patchwork in there. Patchwork is when you take pieces of fabric, like on this little pinwheel, and lay them out in small patterns and create blocks. These are probably, these blocks like the single pinwheel here, it's on the sides of my hand. This area right here. That's a single block was made, and then they took several of them and put them together to create, in this case, probably a crib quilt. It's only about this wide, about 2.5 feet wide and 4 or 5 feet long. So this is probably a crib quilt. It's only about 3 by 3 from the 1930s or 40s. But again, it's hand stitched, so you can see that. Let's see if I can get a good spot here in the camera. The stitching is all done by hand. You can see the little line of stitching there. The easiest way to tell if a quilt is hand stitched or machine quilted is by looking at the stitching closely and seeing if there's variation in the stitch. A machine will do the stitching repetitively perfectly every time, right? There's not going to be any variation in the length of the stitch. There might be some based upon how quickly or slowly you're feeding the material into the sewing machine. But by and large, the stitching is going to be very, very, very replicated. It's going to be very, very, it's going to be the same over and over and over again. And so you want to make sure that when you're looking at those quilts, that to look at the stitch work and see if there's differences, if there's variation in the length of the stitching, that's really going to be your best option, your best indicator that a quilt is hand stitched. And oftentimes stitches are hand stitched and machine quilted at the same time. There might be piecework that was done by hand, but then they did overall stitch work that was done by machine just for efficiency of time, right? Sewing machines were a great invention, and they moved our society forward in ways that the computer is doing now, because it allowed so much more efficiency and be able to get so much more work done, generally by the woman of the house. She was able to get that done and then do other tasks in the same time that it took to do just the quilt before. So the sewing machine, looking at the value of quilts, a machine done quilt is worth less, but it saved the woman making it so much time. And I'm going to refer to this as mainly a woman's in the female vernacular, simply because historically women have done 98% of the quilting, roughly. And still today, women are much more apt to be quilters than men. And so I don't mean to be sexist, it's just historically that's the way it's been. Interestingly enough, I mentioned earlier that quilting is one of the few antique things that is still done contemporarily. In the United States, it's estimated there are still between 9 and 11 million people quilting on an annual basis. I assume that number's gone up this year with all the time we're spending at home. There's been a renaissance in crafts, arts and crafts, and things that people can do at home to spend time since we're not going out. So I imagine that number's even gone up in 2020 compared to what they were predicting it to be. There's been several studies on this. There's an American Quilt Society, which I have a link here in the comments. I'll show it right now. American Quilter has a ton of information about different quilt patterns, history of what to use, how to do it, and all kinds of information. That's posted in the comments below. It's a great resource for all kinds of different facets and information about quilts. So what gives a quilt value in the antique secondary auction market? Well, first and foremost is condition. If you have two similar quilts and one's in beautiful condition, like the one behind me, which is a 1930s kind of Art Deco style applique quilt, patchwork quilt, that's going to be worth a lot more than a similar quilt that is stained, ripped, and torn. So condition, regardless of the age, is going to be a leading factor. In fact, if you have a quilt in excellent condition, I was looking at Rocky Mountain Quilts page here today. They have quilts in her inventory. I believe she's out in Colorado, Rocky Mountain. Her quilts are, generally speaking, in ready to put on your bed condition, right? If they were damaged, she's had them restored or restored them in-house or bought them from a source that way. Her quilts are at the minimum in the mid-hundreds for a common quilt, but go up into the multiple thousands of dollars, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 for really fine quilts in fine condition. Whereas, yeah, thanks for that. If you like anything I say, hit the like button, thumbs up button. If you have questions, please post them below. Love to answer any questions you have or address any issues, topics that you might have to consider. But a quilt that's worth $1,000 in perfect condition might be worth $25 if the condition is bad, if it's sellable at all. And we have a collection of 100 or so quilts and quilt tops in our auction coming up. And this one behind me is in spectacular condition. We expect it to sell really, really well because of condition. And also we'll talk a little bit more on other factors. But we also have quilts in here that are considered cutter quilts. They have holes in them. They have stains. They have wear. The edges are frayed from use. This quilt behind me actually has a slot across the top that was put in there so that the quilt could hang. So it hasn't touched a bed in who knows how long, because that looks like it's been put on in the 70s, right? So this quilt has always been a show quilt, much more so than a used quilt that you would expect to find on a bed. And value is such a huge variation. The record for the highest priced quilt that I could find is $264,000 for the reconciliation quilt that Sotheby's sold in 1991. Now that was very historically important quilt. So the provenance on that, the imagery on that, the condition of that was all as good as it could be. Baltimore album quilts, and we're talking mainly America, North American quilting here, because that's what we're in Kansas City. That's what we're going to see. Baltimore album quilts, Maryland album quilts, were 20 years ago bringing upwards of $150,000, $200,000. Now they're bringing much more in the $20,000 to $40,000, maybe $50,000 range. So you can see that the market has definitely ebbed and flowed, but we're seeing that there's a renewed interest in quilts for use, and as a hobby. And oftentimes hobbyists are the most active collectors because they want inspiration and they want to look at the old colors and fabrics. So condition is a huge, huge factor. The quality of the work. If you have two quilts side by side and the stitching on one is 10 or 11 or 12 stitches per inch, and the other quilt is 6, 7, or 8 stitches per inch, well, that quilt with the more stitches per inch is going to have more value because they put more time and effort into it, and they finish it better. It'll also last longer. When I see quilts with higher stitch count, they were regarded more as a piece of fine work originally, so they're usually in better condition. And I think they also have a tendency to last longer. I think the stitching helps. Anything, whether it's glass or pottery or textiles, friction is your biggest concern as far as causing condition issues. And in fabric, no more. It's obvious. If you have, an old pair of jeans, they're probably worn, where your thighs rub, or where you sit down, or where you have a wallet in your pocket, and there's a lot of friction and tension in that spot. The same thing for a quilt. If there's friction, if there's movement, that fabric's going to deteriorate faster. And I didn't bring any quilts over here with bad condition issues to show you, because the more you move them, the more they will fall apart. 19th century Victorian quilts are beautiful, but hard to find in excellent condition because many of them were made of silk, or patches were made from silk, and that silk deteriorates quickly over time. And by no fault of anything, it can be sitting flat, no movement, no nothing, and it just deteriorates because silk is such a fine textile. And so to find fabrics of that time frame, quilts of that time frame in excellent condition is really hard. That's why a premium is paid for those quilts in excellent condition. So we talked about condition. We talked about the quality of the work. Of course, the pattern. Some patterns are more complex and more in depth than others. The more work done, the quilt behind me has a lot of geometry. You have Art Deco angles. You have the angles of the pots for the flowers and all those kinds of things. So the geometry of it is amazing. Laying that out, getting it to it fits the space. You can see that has 3 rows of flowers across. I think it's 5 rows long. And so the quality of that, the detail taken to get that all laid out correctly and spaced correctly is really important. The overall aesthetic appeal, how does it look? This is a beautiful piece behind me. The great soft pastel colors, good proportions. There's nothing really out of place. Where's that quilt top? I want to pull that out. Let me see if I can find this real quick. We have, I'm looking at, on the other side of the room, we have 9 stacks, 8 stacks of quilts, about 15 each, that have amazing quilts in them. And I wanted to show that there's a quilt top that has the blocks in the center are done really, really well. But when they attach the border, they got skewed, they got offset. So it will never lay right because it's just mounted crooked. I mean, it's literally mounted crooked, which will take this great quilt top that could be finished out and drop its value quite a bit because it has to be either reworked to try and balance that or finished out that way. And it'll always be crooked. No matter how you lay it on your bed, the pattern will always be crooked. So the overall appearance of a quilt is just like a painting or a piece of artwork. How it looks on the bed, how it looks on the wall, if you want to hang it on the wall, is so important. Colors, colors are just like home decor, and there are some colors that are more popular now than before. And so the colors of a quilt will absolutely affect value. They can also help you determine age, right? So we have in this quilt lecture we're working on, we have quilts from about the 1860s through the 1990s. There's one quilt that's dated 1990, but there's a lot of quilts from the 1970s actually, and you can see the avocados and the oranges. And it really that's absolutely from the 1970s because the color's right. They also did a lot of cross stitch on quilts in that time frame, and that shows up in these quilts. So another way to help date them is to look at the materials used. Polyester has not been around for a long time, comparatively speaking. Cottons and wools and silks are historically available materials, where others didn't come in until later. And so looking at that, so that the age is another factor, right? So if you have a brand new quilt, it's probably going to be less than an antique quilt if the antique quilt is the same quality, overall appearance, and condition. Again, the condition is so important to judge. And new quilts, buying quilts from a quilter is a bit pricey simply because the quilter's time has value and the materials have value and cost. If you go to buy the fabric just to make a quilt, it's not, you don't get the stuff for nothing. It's not like in the days of old where they took scraps and took leftover feed sacks or clothing or silk or ties and made quilts. They took, that's what they did then. So they were using, economically expanding their value of the house by using objects that weren't usable in their original state anymore. A pair of pants wears out, you still have a lot of fabric that's very solid and stable, but the knees are shredded, so you can't wear it anymore, or you get a hole somewhere. But the rest of the fabric is usable, so you use it to make a quilt to keep you warm during the winter. Let's show you a couple more quilts I have set off to the side here to show you some different examples. This quilt here has several things going on, actually. It has like some cross stitch, but this is real thick, heavy cross stitch. It also has some trapunto or stuffed work these flowers have a second layer of padding underneath them. And so you can see that it raises up just a bit from the fabric of the quilt to give it some three-dimensionality to it. Hand stitching around it in the other panels. That's hand stitch decoration. So this has piecework, trapunto work, stitch work, all in the same quilt. And this is a beautiful 1930s. It's for a full size bed. Size is of course important to quilt size to quilts too, right? So this quilt here, the little crib quilt, if this was for a full size queen size bed, it's going to be worth more than the crib quilt, only because it's bigger and using more opportunities to use it. We only have babies for a limited time, thank goodness, as mine are now in high school and college. But the size makes a difference as well. Let's look at another quilt here that's probably 1860s, and these are pretty well known. This was probably fugitive green, so this a different green than here that's faded to this gray. So fabrics fade over here. So you can see here what I was telling you about before about the fabric just wearing. See these white spots in the red? And first off, this red would have been a much more brilliant red. But those white spots is where there's been friction over the years and worn through. And some fabrics are more stout and stable than others. You can see here that these greens are very solid yet, but this red has a lot of wear that wears through to the base. Several of these are online referenced as being from Texas. You want to do that one? I want to hit this one, which I don't know if that's always true or not. But that's just another great looking quilt. There are several of these. And again, we have stitch work and we have piecework and applique work. So there's a lot of nice things going on here. And then one of the other things that can help affect value is the back of a quilt. So one of the things that we just talked about is using the materials that they have, right? Using old clothing, old feed sacks, scraps of fabric to make your quilt. That also applies to the back. We have this big flower basket quilt, right? And this thing is big, and these squares are huge. You can only see, that's one big square of a flower basket. But what's really cool about this quilt, and again, this is looking at the fabric real quick, the stitching. This probably dates to about 1920 or 1930. And it's really a spectacular quilt. The stitching looks like it's about 7 or 8 stitches per inch, so that quality is not as high as advanced collector like. But it's still nice. It's all hand stitched. The baskets are beautifully laid. They're big and bold and graphic. So that's really a positive. But the other thing that's really cool about this, let me find the right corner. Where did my corner go? I just had it, so I can get to it really easily. Oh, live TV, how much fun. Here we go. So you can see on the back that this has LL Best Made sheetings. So they used an old feed sack as the back on this, which is one of those little details that it's hard to believe that the back of a quilt can make a difference in the value, but this one absolutely does, because it has that. You can really, with a little bit of research, we can find out when that company was made, around where that company was, which will help us determine where this quilt was made. And so it helps you go into more of a geographic spot that a quilt is from than just a generic quilt. And quilts are made, of course, all over the country, all throughout history, and all over the world. Like I said, they started, quilting is known to go back to the medieval times. And so quilts are made in every country in the world, because every country in the world has cold spots, right? Or the need, any colder climate, I guess, around the equator, you may not need a quilt too much. But in any place that has colder climates, quilting became really popular or necessary just to try and stay warm. So thanks for watching Behind the Gavel with Jason's weekly show. We talk about antiques, collectibles, auctions, things like that. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd love it if you just tell us where you're watching from below. And if you have any questions for us, you can always reach out to us at info@kcauctioncompany.com. And we love the likes, the hearts, all that kind of stuff. We really appreciate that. You can always give us a phone call at 816-283-3633. And please post your questions below. Of course, our website is kcauctioncompany.com. You can always get a hold of us with questions about this episode, other episodes. If you have guests that you think would be interesting or topics you want us to talk about, please let us know. And otherwise, we'll be back to you next Friday. I don't know the topic or guest right now. We're in the midst of renovating our new space, so a lot of my time is being taken up with that. And I don't have a production staff; I have a me staff. So these are all down to me as far as getting guests and thinking up topics for the show. So thank you all so much for watching. Have a great week. This is a non-football week for my football fans. Kansas City is in the Super Bowl again, and excited about that here in Kansas City. And again, if you have questions posted below, send us an email. We'll be happy to answer them. If you have questions about things you want to sell or get appraisals on, reach out to us for that as well. Thank you. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.